Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Literacy in Social Studies, Layered Learning with Primary and Secondary Sources. My name is Martin Andrews, your host, Creative Director at InquireED, and today's webinar is the second in our Deeper Learning in Social Studies series presented by the National Council for the Social Studies and InquireED. And the National Council for the Social Studies, it's the largest professional association in the country devoted solely to social studies education. And this summer, yay, we're talking about summer. That's great. They are having a summer virtual conference, The Power of Civil Discourse, Fostering Empathy and Understanding in the Classroom. Take a look at that, June 25th and 26th. You can go to socialstudies.org/SVC 2025 to find out more. I'm sure that it will be a great experience there. You might want to submit a proposal by April 4th. That deadline's coming up soon. And to be part of the conference yourself. This webinar is also brought to you by InquireED. InquireED supports teachers with high quality instructional materials that make joyful, rigorous, and transferable learning possible for every student. Our two social studies curricula, Inquiry Journeys K-5 and Middle School World History, are used across the country to help students build deep content knowledge and develop the inquiry skills essential for a thriving democracy. You can always find out more at inquireed.org, or you can send me an email. I'm going to stop my share and have Janelle Janelle Marker, our guest today. Hey, Janelle, how are you?
Hi, I'm great, Martin.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I'm going to read a little bit about you, and then you can tell us a little more about you. Janelle brings 12 years of experience as a classroom teacher, instructional coach, and school administrator. She earned her MEd in Education Policy and Management from Harvard, focusing on school reform and project-based learning. With an equity lens, she has worked to build students' leadership, communication, critical reading, and collaboration skills. She joined InquireED in July 2021 and now leads our curriculum team as head of curriculum. Janelle, it's great to have you.
It's great to be here. I'm really
Yeah.
excited to talk about
Um,
this topic today.
yeah, I mean, it's a topic that your brain is always thinking about. I know that you are in the development of some units right now that you kind of brought with you to talk about. I think that I'm gonna try to get my screen share back up, and then kind of like I know you brought some examples, you brought some questions. Why don't you start us off?
Yeah, great. I am really excited to dig into this topic with everyone today. This idea of a layered learning design. And before getting into the nitty-gritty of it, I just wanted to really start high level, um, and really start with a concrete example of this approach to using sources and tasks in instruction from content that, as you mentioned, Martin, our team is currently developing. So the example that I'm going to share is from a unit of instruction that's focused on geography and natural resources, and specifically the issue of water scarcity and management in California, because our team is in process of developing some California specific social studies content for our Inquiry Journeys curriculum. So I wanted to start by taking a look, everyone, at this slide, which shows some of the sources that students engage with as they explore this topic of water management in California. And before, like I said, before we get into anything else, I just wanted you all to share some of your thinking about this use of sources. So as you can see here, we've got just a variety of sources we're having students engage with. We've got everything from some primary sources to some data. We've got videos, photographs. And as you're looking at these, I really want you to take a moment to consider what are the benefits of having students investigate a diverse group of primary and secondary sources like these. And please drop your ideas in the chat. Just high level, what are some of the benefits of having students investigate a diverse group of primary and secondary sources as they're exploring a topic like this? I see things about multiple viewpoints. I see a note about, yeah, being able to give kids multiple entry points as they're coming in with different levels and skills.
Daniel used the word grappling, Janelle, which is a term that we're fond of.
Mm. Yeah, they're able to compare contrast. And I saw multiple people talking about engagement, multiple entry points. And I also see people bringing up terms like literacy, media literacy, which is part of what we really want to dig into here today. Okay, great. Yes. So we are in agreement that there are lots of different benefits to having kids be able to engage with a topic like this from multiple different entry points through multiple different types and a variety of sources. I then want you to share some of your thinking in the chat in response to this question. What are the challenges of having students investigate a diverse group of primary and secondary sources like these? So we've shared some of the benefits. What might be challenging about this approach to sources with students? Yes, finding them. Our team is very familiar with that challenge. Reading levels. Yep. Reading Lexile, right? These different sources, you're going to run into them presenting different levels of complexity for students to engage with. Time consuming. Dana saying time consuming. I'm wondering if that's time consuming I see it as both ways. It's time consuming to find all those sources as the designer, and then time consuming in the classroom, having kids engage with the topic from multiple different entry points through multiple different sources. Yeah, so I see some of you bringing up these topics of time constraints, complexity. This is where the concept of layering primary and secondary sources comes in. So let's go there. So what do we mean by layered learning? Layered learning, as I'm defining it here, is the process of choosing and sequencing both sources and tasks across a period of instruction or an inquiry. Students gradually are able to build their knowledge and skills while really importantly not reaching a point of cognitive overload. So as you saw in that sort of flyover sample of texts and sources, students in this type of design are able to access complex texts, are able to build schema as they're engaging with different sources around a similar topic. They can then transfer those understandings to examples beyond just the singular source that they were first engaging with. So some of the benefits of this approach to sequencing sources and tasks is that it provides, as you all said, multiple perspectives for students to compare and contrast. It also allows the people, my team, you all who are designing these learning experiences to gradually increase the complexity of tasks and build confidence and expertise for kids. And it also encourages deeper inquiry, problem solving, and real world connections.
Is it, Janelle, I'm going to jump in. Is this, like, I think about this from an ELA perspective, and ELA teachers are often building text sets to maybe get students to a place where they can really dig into a complex text. Is it the same thing in social studies? Is there a difference in social studies? I'm curious about like the difference between an ELA approach and a social studies approach.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Martin. There are many elements of this approach to layering sources and tasks that's really similar to what is happening in an ELA classroom. So ELA teachers often layer text to build background knowledge so that students can tackle a complex anchor text. And we need to do this exact same approach when we're designing for a social studies classroom. So kids need that background knowledge. It gives them multiple entry points and ensures that they can handle more challenging sources. I would say this approach to layering sources so that students can access more complex texts is particularly important for students in a social studies setting, because we need students, we're always aiming for students to be able to access primary sources, which, as we all know, primary sources typically present higher levels of text complexity and challenge for students, both either in their unfamiliarity of language or their format. However, I'd say that in a social studies, whereas that's similar to an ELA classroom, this goal of getting kids to be able to access more complex or challenging texts. In a social studies setting, we're really going beyond that, in that we also want students to develop deeper conceptual understanding, and that's an additional reason for us to be taking this approach to design. It's not just about reading a difficult text in this case, it's about getting kids to be able to wrestle with big ideas, like, for instance, rights and responsibilities, migration and movement, or conflict and compromise, and then being able to transfer those ideas to the world around them. So in this example I was sharing earlier, and that I want to dig into more today, this California content's about water scarcity and management, yes, but it ties into broader questions of environmental stewardship and human impacts. And the only way we're going to be able to get kids to be able to grapple with these big ideas of stewardship, and the way that humans engage with their environment and can impact their environment, is to build that background knowledge over time through multiple different exposures to different sources. So, I mean, in some, I'd say in the social studies context, students are walking away from these types of learning experiences with a broader and more rich knowledge base. Whereas in the ELA context, the focus is more on students building skills as their primary takeaway, like robust reading and text analysis skills, which obviously is also important, but just, I think, slightly different end goals.
Yeah. Thanks. I know that you now are gonna like dig into the steps. So let's dig in.
Yeah, great. So, thanks. I just wanted to set the stage there to begin with, sort of like why we design in this way, the value, but also as we surface some of the challenges. So now I wanted to walk through kind of the steps that we think about as we approach this layered learning design. And we'll, as we go through those, I'll be returning to some how we address some of the challenges that you all surfaced when we first took a look at that set of sources. So as you can see here, I start with identifying the content that we're going to cover. We then move on to crafting compelling questions. Then we select our primary sources and then think about secondary sources to layer along with those. And then we think about how we align tasks to those specific sources that we're having students engage with. So to start, yeah, I think we always want to start with what is the content that we are going to be having students engage with? What is it that we need to cover? This is often driven by specific standards. In the case of this example that I'm going to have us look at today, we're designing curriculum to align with California's social studies standards. And specifically, the learning experiences that I'm going to be having us look at are in response to this one specific California social studies standard for fourth grade, where the standard is asking students to trace the evolution of California's water system into a network of dams, aqueducts, and reservoirs. Pretty specific. So, yeah, that's the content that that for this example, that we know that we need kids to know about California's water system.
So anyone starts with their state standards or their required scope and sequence, or if you have a little more freedom,
Right.
whatever it is that you're choosing in terms of the investigation, or whatever, if you're in a really open inquiry, what the students are choosing. But it's
Absolutely.
starting with that content.
Yeah. Yeah. So from there, once you know what it is that kids are, the content, the stuff that kids are going to be learning about, then we are moving on to really what their entry point is going to be. So we then are going to be crafting a compelling question. And this question is the thing that's going to drive students' curiosity. It's also going to lay the groundwork for deeper exploration. And when we're designing these questions, it's really important to think about, excuse me, questions. Sorry, I've got that the winter thing that went around and left me with a never-ending cough. So
Yeah.
apologies for people who are going to bear with me through this. Um, but anyway, we really think about questions that are complex, they're open-ended, they don't have a simple right or wrong answer, and they can really spark students' investigation. This is where we get to be both really creative in generating questions that we really think are going to get kids interested in the topic, but also we have to get, I think, in these moments of crafting these questions, anyone who's done this before will agree, you have to also think really technically. So you get to be really creative, but also make sure that these questions that we're asking kids really align with the content as well as to any larger investigation that we're having kids do. So, and I'd love for you all to take a little bit of a stab at this as well. The challenge of this, we've probably all been there where we've crafted a question that we think is going to take kids in a direction, and then you realize it's taking them off somewhere else. So it's quite it's both an art and a technical piece that's really going to set up the rest of your work. So I'd love to invite you all in the chat to get kind of creative with me here. And what is a question that you might have kids wrestle with or use to enter this type of content? Here's, as a reminder, the standard that we're designing the content around, California's water system. What's a question, and please drop ideas in the chat, that you might have students ask as they're approaching content like this to get them, again, interested, spark their curiosity, drive further investigation, but also keep it open-ended. We're looking for things beyond just one right or wrong answer. Oh, that's really interesting. Mhm.
Mm.
More responsibilities. We definitely, as we were thinking about this content, we're wanting to get kids thinking about, yeah, weighing different responsibilities or things to consider. Where does water come from? Interesting.
It's really such an invitation, these questions, right? Like it's, when you think about trace the evolution of California's water system, it's so like it seems like there's one right answer. It seems like it's just a bucket of boring content. And these questions like, who owns water? Are pistachios worth it? Um,
Oh, getting right to the controversy there. I love it.
I
Um,
really love my almond milk that much.
right, right. Okay, well, thank you for all those great ideas. We throw out a lot as we're generating options. The one that we landed on for this content is, what do we need to consider when using scarce resources? And part of the reason we went in this direction is that this content, this California water system content, this is one module that's part of a larger unit-long investigation about stewardship of the environment at large in California.
Mm.
So we've prior to this module, we had a module of learning where kids are learning about California's diverse geography and the different regions of the state. Students learn about the human historical interaction with their environment in the state. And then we come to this one where students are really, this question is going to invite them to really into the complex weighing of trade-offs that is inherent in issues of resource scarcity and ties to this larger investigation about stewardship. Students are going to have to wrestle with the environmental impacts of water management, along with the impacts that different water movement decisions ultimately have on different groups of people and industries. I will say something else that our designers really wrestled with in landing on this question, and as we kicked around different ideas and entry points for this content, we were trying to be very careful. There were some routes we thought about going down that we were worried would put kids in a position where they were feeling like they had to like solve California's water crisis, which that's another thing you have to kind of be careful with some of these questions. You don't want to lead kids down a route where we're kind of putting them in a position to wrestle with things beyond the scope of what is reasonable for them as a young person learning about this content, while also still putting them in the position of wrestling with something that is authentic and a real world problem or question worth asking. So we've had to kind of ride that line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of discussion in the chat just about different time that people have for social studies. We know that if we could wave a magic wand, we would have 45 minutes a day for social studies. But it's a question, when a state like California or others have state history in their standards,
Mhm.
and usually it happens in third or fourth grade, right? And
Yeah.
they have to then the system has to respond and give time to do these kind of deep inquiries. Otherwise, it just becomes like a general gloss over and memorization and facts for that are unconnected. So I just want to acknowledge that, yeah, that's a problem that I know all of you are struggling with for in the early grades, or if you're a curriculum director, you're trying to find time for social studies.
Yeah. Um, it's it's a systems, right? Having to address all the different, and then how do we within that be creative with the time that we're given? We're definitely feeling this designing for the California content, right? They have very, as you can see with this content, very specific standards that the state is asking teachers to cover with students. But what does it look like, in the classroom, in schools? How much time is given? And I know we think a lot also about how to use time well as we're building literacy skills, trying to do double duty where we
Yeah, I
can.
mean, that's one of the things when you're talking about layering literacy skills, layering sources like this, building literacy skills, like stealing a little bit of that ELA time for social studies because you're working on these skills that are so important. Um, yeah, I think stealing some ELA time is recommended.
As a former, yes, ELA coach at a school, yes, I approve of that when we can make it work. I know that's easier said than done. But I think good segue back to the content of, yeah, sources. So how are we having kids engage with these complex texts? So at this point, we've identified the content we're going to have kids learn. We've figured out an entry point as we crafted a compelling question. And here, our next step that we typically take is we really start with our primary sources, selecting those target primary sources, which is a balance of finding sources that present information to students that centers them in a complex and authentic issue that's worth grappling with, while also presenting info in a student accessible way. Like that's the crux, right? As I mentioned before, we all know primary sources. There are some that are very student accessible, but they tend to be more complex and often beyond, especially when we're talking about elementary grades. It's a challenge to find primary sources that are going to authentically bring kids into this topic and this content from a firsthand perspective while also being something that they can access. So these are often the sources also that present this rich opportunity for student investigation and direct which issues we spend more instructional time on. Um, so I'll say
Janelle,
for
is it something where when you're picking these sources, you're not thinking in terms of accessibility, if we dig into that, you're not thinking that this is going to be immediately leveled and understood by students like on day one of this inquiry, right?
Yes, no. I mean, there are sometimes some visual sources that we can use, and we've done that before. We really start with those, but no, I think the question we're just centering ourselves on when we're first looking for these primary sources, and I think there's a like we're calling them target primary sources because we know there is a way we are considering student accessibility. Like kids do need to be able to access this source at a base level, but that we're not assuming that they're able to do that without a lot of pre knowledge building and support and scaffolding. But we imagine that with that we know we can build that around that primary source. and eventually get them there to be able to access it, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But I will say that finding these target primary sources will follow where they lead us. So, for instance, in this water management investigation, we spend some time having students investigate specifically the creation impacts of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which is one of the first large-scale water management projects in California, um, and moved water from the farming community of Owens Valley to Los Angeles. Why did we choose this particular topic? Right, like the standard just says very broadly that kids need to track the evolution of California's water system. It doesn't say anything specific about the Los Angeles Aqueduct as one part of that system. We decided to go there and spend some extra time having students investigate that particular topic because as we did some investigation of California's water system and its history, we found a number of student accessible primary sources that present different perspectives about the impacts of that particular aqueduct. So we could have, focused on the state aqueduct project. We didn't do that because the LA aqueduct we just found had these rich set of primary sources that we saw a path for students to be able to really authentically grapple with this topic.
Is that a common practice where you have you have a broader topic or a broader concept that you're trying to understand, a broader knowledge base, and then you hone in on like a smaller segment of that, a case study, a specific example of that to analyze because students can grasp that. Not only, I guess you're saying you went there because the sources were there, right?
Yeah.
Like, but is there also something instructionally valid in that as well?
Yeah, it's about, I mean, I talked about it in general as a part of this layered learning design approach. It's about building schema for kids. So you can stay at a really high level. And as you said, Martin, right? Like, okay, we've checked off information and facts, but we all know if we've taught kids in a classroom that they're going to really be able to own and transfer knowledge if they can dig into one concrete example. Maybe it's the case study of the Los Angeles Aqueduct. They'll know that and learn that deeply and really understand the concepts behind um, that particular information or case study, and then they can transfer that to other scenarios.
Yeah, and I'll ask you later because I think you said that they actually you're trying to design it so that they get a chance to practice that transfer. So let's
Yeah.
come back to that for sure.
Yeah, so I mean, to go concretely in the sources we found for this particular topic of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, the primary sources that we chose to target, and then I'll talk about how we get the kids to them. Is to your point, Martin, our expectation is we're not lesson one presenting them with this letter from the shop owner, but this is one of them that we were really excited about. So this is an excerpt from a letter written by J JD Black. I was gonna say there's a different JD on my mind, JD Black. This is an ex but he was an activist who lived in the Owens Valley in the early 1900s. And this letter presents a firsthand account of the impacts of the Los Angeles Aqueduct on the people in Owens Valley at the time. So we again, there's going to be some unfamiliar language to students here, perhaps, but this is a source that clearly would give kids a firsthand account of the impacts of a water management situation in California's history, and we felt that this was a really exciting opportunity that kids could access this content if given the right supports to do so. Another example of a primary source that we found in relation to this Los Angeles Aqueduct content is this is a story from a Paiute tribe member where they present the impacts of the Los Angeles Aqueduct on the Paiute people. And the Paiute people are a tribe who have made Owens Valley has been their home for thousands of years. And Owens Valley is the area where the Los Angeles Aqueduct takes its water from and transports it to Los Angeles. So this is the area of California that's feeling the impacts very directly of this aqueduct project as it's moving water from the valley to the city on the coast. Yeah, so those are the two primary sources that we're really targeting in this content to get students to be able to access. And as I've mentioned, primary sources, as we know, present challenges to students, though we are excited that we feel that these are going to be student accessible for fourth graders. They are going to present some challenges. So I'd love to pause for a moment and again invite you all to respond in the chat. What might make these primary sources challenging for students? You can see some of the text here. I've given you a little background on kind of the timing of them. Yeah, so people are getting into the formatting and uh, reading level, vocabulary. Yeah, having to consider bias, author perspective, context, background knowledge has come up in a couple of people's responses, which is, let's go there. So that's a perfect segue into the next piece of this layered learning design that we take into account. So once we've identified these target primary sources, then we'll start to think about the supporting secondary sources that we want to select to build student background knowledge so that they have what they need. Now we know where we're trying to get them to. We really want them to engage with this authentic primary source content that'll give them some of the information they need in this investigation. We then can build in through some more accessible secondary sources the background knowledge kids will need. And this is where we also will intentionally vary these secondary sources in format. These may be short articles, infographics, videos, all in a way that's going to be, again, more accessible and as a way to kind of lay the foundation and breadcrumb towards kids towards the information that they'll be able to access in those primary sources. So concretely for this investigation of the California water system, here are some of the secondary sources that we have students engage with before they ever get to these two primary sources that we'll have them working with later on in the learning series. So we've got a set of maps that students engage with. There's one that shows the precipitation patterns in the state. There's one that shows the major population centers. And there's also one that shows the full California water system, and it shows that Los Angeles Aqueduct as part of this. And those maps really help kids see why there are certain regions of the state that might face greater water scarcity, particularly as they can see where humans are primarily settled over on the coastal region. There's much higher population density as opposed to where there's a primary rainfall and precipitation and snow. And then we've got, you can see this next one is a source I'm very excited about. It's this, what you're seeing here is an intro video to a simulation we have students go through at the beginning of the learning series where they learn about, it just walks them through the basics of managing water resources. They learn about what is a dam, what is an aqueduct, what is a reservoir. These are things that fourth graders are not likely walking into the classroom knowing about. And they need to understand what an aqueduct is to be able to understand what the Los Angeles Aqueduct is doing and its impacts. So that's a way that they can, in a very interactive and concrete way, think about, okay, well, if I put a dam here, does a dam connect to an aqueduct? Does an aqueduct do this or that? And how can I move, if I'm tasked with moving water throughout an area, how might I do that? And then finally, you can see this last video. It's an intro video to specifically the Los Angeles Aqueduct, and it's a short documentary style piece that shows how and why the aqueduct was built. So kids really, now that they have a big picture of just water issues and scarcity in the state at large, they also understand what is a water management system, dams, aqueducts, reservoirs, what are these things? Now they have also the historical background of what was the Los Angeles Aqueduct project and what does it mean? Okay, Owens Valley, where is that? It's taking water from there to Los Angeles. Why? And they get that kind of background schema that they're going to need to make sense of this letter from the shop owner in Owens Valley.
I think there's something about like tr trusting the process of the inquiry that I want to point out. I think one of the traps maybe that I got in when I was teaching was if I encountered even one of these videos or something, I would say, "Oh, my students don't know these words. They're not going to understand this." And I think that one of the ways in which I'm starting to think about layered learning is that the first layer can be a light layer. It's like a base layer, almost like I'm sure those of you who are maybe worked in oil paints, like the first layer isn't everything. It doesn't have to cover everything. So they're developing understanding over time, and it's okay that the first layer is light, that you don't have to pre-teach everything, that you let the layers teach as you go. That's just something that I'm kind of realizing that I would have jumped in to pre-teach and then not let the materials or the layers themselves teach.
Yeah. Yeah, we wrestle with that a lot in how we design, we catch ourselves and pull ourselves back intentionally from pre-teaching. Um, I find myself still doing it all the time. It's so hard to recognize the amount of information kids need to know now versus trusting that they're going to get it in that next source. And that is some of the beauty of the structure of layered learning. They're going to be re-exposed and re-exposed. Do they 100% need to know every example of a dam or exactly the nuance? They're going to see the dam again when it comes up in this next source. And they're
Yeah.
going to understand it more deeply when oh, okay, the dam made this. Oh, right. Dams have environmental impacts because look, this dam created, it displaced all this environment when it filled this valley. Like
Yeah.
it's a building approach that is not always intuitive.
Yeah. So you've got the sources all lined out, right? Lined up and but the sources do not a class sources and questions do not an instructional block make.
No.
You need students to do something with those sources. So I think this next part is where I really, you've really brought a lot of insight in thinking when I'm approaching uh, actually aligning those tasks that you're choosing to the sources. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so as you've seen through this process, we've got kids engaged in this investigation. We've built their background knowledge. We've chosen great sources. And then we have to really carefully figure out how students are going to interact with them. So we then have to really think about which tasks are we pairing with which sources. And some sources are, we have to do that calibration and kind of balance. Some sources are really complex due to people in the chat have surfaced that. It can be a format thing, it can be vocabulary, it can be the background knowledge that they need to understand the source. I'd also say another form of source complexity that we find ourselves calling out frequently in design is just noting that some sources are challenging because they're certain students' first exposure to new content. And so we can't underestimate if kids are learning about an aqueduct for the first time. It may be a grade level text, it may be a very simple source, but that cognitive load of understanding what an aqueduct is, if I've never heard about it or learned about it before that first exposure, that's a complex source of information. And we cannot expect, if we know that kids have this higher cognitive load in just accessing source content, we have to responsively pair that with a task that's going to be simpler.
Mm.
Um, so if the source is really demanding, we're going to pair it with a low rigor task. And so that students don't reach that point of cognitive overwhelm. If the source is easier to grasp, or as we were just talking about, this is maybe the second or third time kids have been exposed to this concept of an aqueduct, then we can amp up the rigor of the task. And that is something that we have to then intentionally do across the course of a learning series. So as we all know, tasks should support a skill build across a series of lessons or a unit. So early on, students might be just identifying or summarizing key ideas. Midway, we have them compare evidence or analyze author intent, and by the end, they're ready to synthesize what they've learned into some creative or argumentative format. So we're upping the complexity of the skills across the course of a set of lessons. Yeah, so I want to actually have us all engage with this kind of dance that we have to do in design of pairing a task with a specific source. As we talked about, we've done all this secondary source background knowledge setting for students to then be able to come and engage with this letter from a resident of Owens Valley. Uh, but then we have to think about the task, and we have to think about what level of complexity is this source, and then therefore can use that to inform the level of complexity of a task or skills that we want kids to be practicing as they're engaging with this source. So before I tell you what our assessment of this source was, I'd love, Martin, I think we've got a poll. I'd love to poll you all and get your thoughts about um, which statement best matches your thinking about this shop owner's letter from 1924? Would you say this is more of a complex source? Knowing that students know what the Los Angeles Aqueduct is at this point and the history of it, or is it not very complex? So perhaps we could have a higher rigor task assigned with it.
This is a fourth grade unit.
Fourth grade unit, yes. So take a look at the vocabulary. People brought up the format, the perspective that students have to consider of a primary source. This is the first time they're engaging with a primary source in this series of lessons.
I think it's interesting too, how many of them have held a physical or like even like written a letter. That's something that's you wouldn't have to think about, 20 years ago or something like that. Someone might have received a letter, like, or seen one at some point in their life.
The
Um,
fourth graders know what an email is yet.
yeah,
Not all of them have gotten even that far. Yeah, but a physical letter, right? There's a lot more schema than we might even think that we need to build.
right. People are at around 70%, so I'm gonna end the poll and just share the results. Janelle, I don't know if you can see those or not.
Yeah, I can see them. So we've got about 80% of you feeling like this is a more complex source, 20% of you feeling it's not very complex, and that makes sense that we've got a little bit of mixed responses. I would hope that we don't all think this is the most out of this world complex text. Otherwise, we wouldn't have felt like it was an appropriate primary source likely to put in front of kids in the first place, even with scaffolding. That said, we did end up deciding that this relatively is a pretty complex source. And one of the reasons I want to call out that, I did make the comment that yes, kids have gotten the schema building from secondary sources up to this point. They know the history of the Los Angeles Aqueduct. This is their first exposure, however, to how the LA Aqueduct affected local people. So we didn't give them a lot of that in secondary sources. We really wanted to hear that as hand accounts. So this is still relatively new information they're getting through this source. The language is dated, there's unfamiliar vocabulary. And so we decided to pair with a lower rigor task. In fact, we use this source in our content to have the teacher model the task of noting the impacts that the Los Angeles aqueduct was having on people in the environment. So we have teachers live annotate this text. It helps model this task that the kids are going to have to do with other sources, but while having them engage with a really authentic, rich primary source. So I'd love to have us consider the same question with two more sources kids engage with in this series of lessons. In this case, we've got a data set of Los Angeles's population growth over time, as well as a photograph of the dry bed of Owens Lake. Just a side note of how, for this purpose, I've got these really, isolated images of the sources here. But the way these are presented to students, they've got additional text, a small caption for both of these, short paragraph of text next to each of these sources that is grade level text, level friendly for students, explaining the data and explaining kids aren't just looking at this dry riverbed with no context of what it is. So they do have some helper text next to them. So taking a look at these two sources, I'd love you all to respond to this new poll. Are you feeling like these are more complex sources or not very complex as we're making the decision about what type of or level complexity of task to pair them with?
People are filling it up really fast, Um, I'll
Yeah.
end here. And when we get to 60%, so a few more of you, and then I will end it and share the results.
We're above 90% of you think that these are lower demand sources. And our team agreed with that as we were thinking about the type of task complexity we could pair this with. I will say, though, I agree that it's also not surprising and shouldn't be overlooked for those of you who said these are more complex sources. Certainly, that is still true, right? We've got the students are having to read data. How familiar are they with reading a data set? So there's still scaffolding that we need to think about and how to support students with these. We didn't have them go off and do this totally independent head down, but the task we decided to pair this with was splitting students into well, first of all, I would say that in general, we made the choice to pair these two sources with our own support texts written by our designers so that that was a helper text for kids to understand the data set. They're not having to just make sense of this information straight looking at the numbers. And then we pair them with the higher rigor task. So students split into small groups to analyze the data and the images. They're doing this without teacher support. They've already seen the teacher model how to pull out impacts. So this is not the first time, nor is it something they've never seen done. And they also are doing this in small groups. So this allows for that targeted teacher support. If, first of all, we set up the task such that teachers can choose which of these two sources different groups are engaging with. So if you've got a group that you think is going to be more easily able to, or more supported by the image in their reading because of whatever different skill sets that group of student brings, you can strategically give one of these two sources to a group. And you can also, this is the point in the lesson where a teacher can go circulate the classroom and provide targeted support to groups that they think will need that extra support, perhaps making sense of the data set, for instance.
I think there's also, Joseph asked a question, really a couple, but one is how do we keep students engaged, especially in high school on when you're in an inquiry like this one. And I would think that the question of rigor also applies to different kind of interactive, collaborative, discussion-based activities. So, a quick turn and talk or a think, pair, share, or a see, think, wonder, things like those are lower rigor, but more interactive. But yet there are higher rigor interactive things like a Socratic seminar and different strategies that you can do. So I think if you're concerned about the engagement, there's still, I think it still applies, right? It's still question, source, and then task, but maybe the task is more interactive, more but it's also aligned rigor wise. Would you say that that's also the case, Janelle?
Yes, I within this, yeah, agree, Martin. There's a lot you can do so much. There's so many levers to be pulled in how you're having kids interact with their peers and be able to discuss. And I really think that also, to go back to the layered learning design, when you are having students do a sustained investigation of a topic like this, and you've started with a compelling question, as a reminder, kids are wrestling with what are the things we need. They start with the simulation of water scarcity. So they really experience, yes, that simulation gets them familiar with what are dams, what are aqueducts, this low level but very not student like known information that they have to have. Um, but then they also understand this real issue of resource and in this case water scarcity and the dilemmas of that. And then you ask them to consider what is it, what are the things we need to consider when making decisions about how to use a scarce resource. And then kids have the background knowledge of the impacts that these types of decisions can have. Students are there's a lot of investment that gets built on the part as you're going through a sustained investigation like that, because they have the background knowledge and then they're getting repeat exposures to information that can help them answer that question. And in the case of this series of learning, kids are driving towards taking this historical knowledge they've learned about the Los Angeles Aqueduct. They also explore the Hetch Hetchy Valley outside of Yosemite, and the impacts of those water management strategies, and then have to apply it more independently at the end of the learning series to a more modern, current water management um, situation or scenario that the state is in the works of considering, that real California voters are having to weigh in on. Um, the Delta Tunnel project, I believe, is the one that they're being asked about towards the end of this learning series. And so kids really also have an authentic reason to be gathering this information and wrestling with the implications of these different things.
I just want to put a plug in for our last webinar, Acquire, Connect, Transfer, because Julie Stern really got into that. And I think that it just pairs so well, Janelle, what you've been talking about. And what you're talking about there is this really, really deep exploration of the LA Aqueduct. And then you are providing them with an opportunity to transfer that learning to the modern context, which they need practice doing. They need practice transferring the knowledge. It's a great way to see how deep the knowledge has become over the course of the inquiry. So that's really, really important. There's some great thank you all for your wonderful comments. I feel like we're getting glazed in the webinar chat. They're like, yay. But one of the questions Jim asked was what background is too much? Like, is there, I don't know why I'm giving a thumbs up to that. My reactions are on, but like, is there too much background knowledge that you could build? Janelle, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
I mean, I think that goes to what you were saying, Martin, is yes, I think there is too much background knowledge. And that point, you've got kids that you're just lecturing them. It's like the glazed over, you're giving me too much factual detail and not letting me have the opportunity to really make meaning of it and apply it. So as I mentioned, and what, I kind of tricked you all to a degree with that one source. I was like, well, just kidding. This is actually the first time kids are really wrestling with the impacts of the Los Angeles Aqueduct on the people of the areas that were directly physically impacted by this project. So we are making those decisions all the time. Like, yes, let's do this flyover, high level, know what the Los Angeles Aqueduct video is, but no, we don't have them read a detailed text about all the inner workings of this particular project, because we want to save the some of it for the primary sources where kids are really getting to grapple and make meaning independently.
Yeah. Janelle, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to have you. I think what our attendees were saying in the chat is that this system makes sense to them,
Mhm.
this layered learning system. So I really appreciate you coming here and sharing today.
Really excited to get the opportunity to share it. Our designers were all former teachers. We very much so appreciate the work that all of you who are on the ground in classrooms, on school sites do every day. And don't take lightly the time we have, because we've been there where you're having to juggle all the things and wear all the hats, and just like the time that we get to put into trying to create this resource for others and share what we've learned and wrestle with it with all of you. Just really appreciate the opportunity to get to talk about it.
Thank you all for spending this time with us, and we really appreciate it. Janelle, thanks again.
Thanks, Martin.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.